we go. That did it. All right. Well, welcome to our in-person audience and our virtual audience as well. I'm Lisa Brabo, CEO for Family Service Agency. That also includes the Santa Maria Valley Youth and Family Center and Guadalupe's Little House by the Park. I have to tell you that it's just so wonderful to see everyone, and I'm already hoarse. I have been talking so much. So I'm just going to try to get through my little bit here. So we're very happy to be here with you, focusing on youth mental health. You all know the United States is experiencing an extreme teenage mental health crisis. From 2009 to 2021, the share of American high school students who say they feel persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness rose from 26%, which was already darn high, to 44%. This is according to a new CDC study, and CDC is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We're clearly seeing this locally, this crisis locally, with a significant increase in youth struggling with anxiety, depression, panic attacks, and suicidal ideation. FSA and other youth-serving organizations are experiencing an increased intensity of cases and an increased demand for services. Literally, everyone we know has a waiting list. Everyone. At FSA, we provide mental health counseling for anyone 5 years of age and older, all the way up to age 90 so far this year, and we'll probably get higher than that. But let me tell you about Angelica. She started therapy with FSA when she was 11 years old and living in a foster home. Growing up, Angelica experienced complex trauma, including emotional and physical abuse. She was removed from her mother's care at age 5 and has been in and out of the foster care system ever since. Angelica displayed significant depressive symptoms such as low self-esteem and little interest or pleasure in doing things. She blamed herself for being removed from her mother's care. She experienced regular suicidal ideation and attempted suicide through the ingestion of pills. With consistent therapy multiple times a week facilitated by FSA's dedicated and caring therapist, Angelica slowly learned to trust another person. She learned ways to challenge things like her negative thoughts with positive self-talk. Every morning she would say aloud, "I am loved, I am beautiful, and I am worthy." Over time, her self-esteem increased and her depression decreased. Angelica has had no suicidal ideation or self-harm for months. She now has friends, where previously she had none. She brightens up and giggles when talking about them. She recently reunified with her mother, and both are invested in repairing the relationship. Yes, truly. Definitely worthy of applause. So along with mental health counseling such as this, FSA also teaches adults youth mental health first aid. We do this with our partners, the Mental Wellness Center and YouthWell. Youth mental health first aid teaches adults how to identify, understand, and respond to signs of mental health and substance use challenges among young people ages 12 to 18. You can find the latest class offerings on our website, so don't miss it. It's a really good opportunity. Families and seniors can also come to FSA for help accessing concrete resources such as healthcare, food, shelter, and childcare, as well as parent education. We help families and seniors stabilize, no matter the issues, through connections to resources, active skill building, and support. Our staff are culturally sensitive and understand the impacts of trauma, and we're working together with you and many partners to create a stronger, healthier community. We're so pleased to have so many partner agencies with us here tonight. You have totally energized me. Thank you for doing that. And we're tremendously thankful for your active collaboration and support. We're equally thankful for the support of the elected officials that are present here tonight. For the County Board of Supervisors, we have Joan Hartman and Greg Hart. Thank you for being here. We also have County Superintendent of Schools, Susan Salcido, Thank you, Susan. Sheriff Bill Brown is here as well. We have Santa Barbara City Council member Kristen Snedden also here tonight. And we have SBUSD board member and First Five Executive Director Wendy Sims Moten here as well. Yes, lots of support here for all of you, absolutely. So lastly, I want to say thank you to the FSA board. You are incredible, and I love working with you. My very favorite board, I can tell you. Thank you to FSA staff for your amazing fortitude and dedication. And thank you to the committee and staff who put this event together. Great job, obviously. Way to go. Okay, and now on to our presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Vinson to you this evening. Dr. Vinson is a physician who specializes in adult, child and adolescent, and forensic psychiatry. She's the founder of L'Oreal Psych Group, an Atlanta, Georgia-based mental health practice, providing expert care and consultation. Dr. Vinson is also the founder of L'Oreal Forensics, which provides consultation in a wide variety of cases in criminal, civil, and family court. In addition, Dr. Vinson is an associate clinical professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at Morehouse School of Medicine. Yeah, very impressive, I agree. She is also the co-editor of two texts, Social Injustice and Mental Health, and Pediatric Mental Health for Primary Care Providers. She's written book chapters on the social determinants of children's health, children's mental health, I should say, child trauma, social media and children's mental health, and fostering resilience. So welcome, Dr. Vinson.
Can you all hear me? Yes. All right. Well, you know, people talk about Southern hospitality, but I will tell you, you guys talk about welcoming. I'm so glad to be here this evening. And we'll have some prepared content, and then we'll have a conversation and Q&A. So thinking about the critical need to serve the whole child when we think about mental health. You may not expect a psychiatrist to say this, but what we do in the office in that 30 minutes or that hour is not the most critical part of the work, ever. Medications are never the most critical part of the work or of helping a child be well. So much of that has to do with where they live, work, play, and learn, and that is what serving the whole child is about. And so we'll talk about some special considerations when it comes to youth mental health. That's a little different than talking about mental health more broadly when we're just talking about adults. The issue of poverty, housing, education, and then, of course, action. So in medical school, you go through all of these different rotations. A lot of them are focused on adults. When you get to pediatrics, of course, the focus is on children and adolescents. And one of the things they say all the time is that kids aren't just little adults, that you can't just take what you know from adults and do a little bit less and it's going to translate. You have to actually adjust it for their developmental concerns, for the ways that their bodies metabolize medications, for the things that are different about what it's like to move through the world as a minor. And we have to do that when we're thinking about social determinants of mental health, and we're thinking about mental health as well. So my co-editor for the Social Injustice and Mental Health book, Dr. Shim, she's an adult psychiatrist, and we were talking about another project we were working on together where the idea was that we were going to look at policies that specifically benefited a certain group of folks that were really effective at helping them. And she wanted me to do one about children, and we were really struggling to come up with one. And she said, there must be something. But everything she came up with, I was like, these are the issues with that. And at the end of the conversation, I ended up coming back to something that I say often, which sounds a bit flippant, but I think is true if you look at how our society is structured, the places we decide to put resources, and the places that we chronically under-resourced, and it's that we really don't care about kids. So the child and adolescent population is uniquely impacted by the social determinants of mental health. And the social determinants of mental health are mediated by our systems and our societal structures. Children are legally dependent, whether on the family or the child welfare system, to make sure that their basic needs are met. And they do not have control over the resources that they need to have those needs met. And they can't independently take care of these things. And so that's a long-winded way of the saying that it takes a village to raise a child, right? It takes a society to make decisions, to make sure that children are growing up in places where they are protected and have the things that they need. Additionally, youth are physically, cognitively, and emotionally immature, rendering them susceptible to abuse and exploitation, limiting their means to support themselves, and undercutting their ability to skillfully navigate social situations and societal structures. We talk about disparities and inequities and isms, but we don't talk about adultism a whole lot, right? We don't talk about kids as a marginalized group or a disempowered group. But when you look at whether they have a voice, when you look at outcomes like poverty, when you look at outcomes like mental health and suicidality, they are a disempowered group, a marginalized group, a group that is suffering from one of the isms. We also know they're often subject to compulsory education, and I heard that your superintendent got cheers, so I think that's a great thing for this community. But you know, we have a very unequal educational system in this country. And in some places, rather than school being a place where you grow and learn and realize your potential, it's a place where you're labeled and marginalized and excluded. And so what we see here, and hopefully this will make sense why I'm talking about this when it comes to mental health by the end of this, is that we have something called structural trauma. And we talk a lot about the ACEs, the original ACE study that really focused on interpersonal trauma and things that happen in families. We don't talk a whole lot about how systems fail children and families and how they do it over and over again. And structural trauma is when our systems and structures, the way they normally work, not when something goes wrong, not when there's a problem, but the way that they routinely operate, do so in a way that's actually harmful. So, of course, we've all been through a collective trauma these past few years with the coronavirus and everything that's come from it. And what we saw and what we could have predicted is that the groups that were already marginalized, that already didn't have resources, that were already struggling to make ends meet, were disproportionately impacted by this virus on multiple levels. So by the numbers. So the poverty threshold for a family of four, and this number always shocks me whenever I look it up, it's $27,750. So whenever you're looking at this data about poverty rates, it's artificially low because we all know you cannot consistently meet the needs of a family of four with that amount of money. But using that metric, in California, children 0 to 5, 1 out of 4 are living in poverty. 2.3 million are living with food insecurity. So we're talking about the social determinants of mental health, housing, adequate nutrition, stability in where you live. You can't have those things if you don't have the funds to meet basic needs. And so what we've seen in response to COVID and all of the things that came with it are that demand has gone up for mental health services. And in some ways, supply and access has gone down because there's been a lot of burnout. People are retiring. So resources to get treatment in some areas have gone down. And so we already had a mismatch between what was needed and what was available. And now we've seen that exacerbated. And so social determinants of mental health like housing, food, access to mental health care are all things that are going to impact how you think, feel, and behave. And at their core, that's what mental health is about, right? It's about the ability to learn, the ability to grow, the ability to cope adaptively with what's going on in your environment. And when those things aren't able to be done, when they make it hard for you to function, that's when we start to tip into illness. But you can imagine, if I'm trying to help a child who doesn't have a safe place to lay their head at night, whose developing brain doesn't have the nutrients that it needs, or whose grandparent can't consistently get them to their services, that's going to affect the course of their treatment and the course of their symptoms. And it's a determinant as well. So when we're thinking about family systems, because of course no child exists on their own, the health of the mother and her availability for services, and what's in the environment are all critical considerations. And at the end of the day, if kids don't have safety, stability, and the basic things that they need, it's going to be very difficult for them to have that solid foundation, or to be able to look for a future, or to be able to believe that their choices are going to shape what that future looks like. And then when it comes to mental health diagnoses and the things that cause people to show up in mental health offices, often it's the troubles with emotional regulation, with feeling anxious, with feeling angry, and being able to manage and channel that. If you had the luxury of growing up in a home where you were safe, and the worst thing that happened was maybe your parent was disappointed in you, or you got your electronics taken away, then anxiety isn't necessarily paired with a fear that something terrible is going to happen to you. If you didn't have that luxury, then that feeling can cause a cascade of feelings and emotions. It can be hard to self-regulate or understand the difference between truly life-threatening situations and the things you've experienced in the past. And that's often what brings children in for services. You know, there are all these labels that get attached to them, but at the end of the day, a lot of it is trauma. And a lot of it is misdiagnosed or dual diagnosed. And this issue of emotional regulation is one that has to do with the environment that people are in, but also the things that their developing brain is exposed to. So when you look at mediators of how people do over time, not all people who are exposed to trauma are going to develop mental illness, but we know that a lot of those folks are experiencing trauma on multiple levels. And at a biological level, I think it's helpful to think about the brain as the organ that it is. A lot of times we think about it differently than we think about hearts or lungs or things like that, but it's tissue. It's a living organ. And when people are experiencing things that threaten their sense of safety and stability, like not having a safe place to live or not knowing what the next day is going to bring, that causes a state of chronic stress and hormone exposure, which can be really critical for developing brains. And we see that it affects not only how the brain looks, like the brain architecture, how big different parts of the brain are, but also the circuitry in the brain, which parts are more active and which parts are less active. And that, as you can imagine, has implications for things like memory, decision-making, the ability to weigh pros and cons, things that are going to bring folks into mental health service care. So, as was mentioned, I practice in Atlanta, Georgia. I have a private practice on the east side of town, and I work in a county clinic on the west side of town. The east side of town, the zip code is 30307. On the west side of town, it's 30331. So these communities are very different. 30307, the family median income is $132,000 with a mean of $201,000. And in 30331, it's $47,000 with a family mean of $70,000. Mind you, these communities are no more than 5 miles apart. I teach at Morehouse School of Medicine and Emory School of Medicine, and sometimes I'll have students join me at both of these sites. When I'm telling the students about parking and logistics of getting there, when they're coming to the east side, I tell them there's street parking available and a number of nice restaurants and coffee shops within walking distance. When they come to the west side of town, I say it's in a food desert. Bring your lunch. So just based on that alone, you can probably guess which has the highest graduation rate of the schools that are zoned for that area, which has math and English proficiency scores of 16 and 9% respectively, which has 99% free lunch, which has the highest student-teacher ratio. The one you might not get is which has a 73.4% graduation rate. There's an educator in the Bay Area named Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade, and he says, if you want to oppress people, you don't deny them school because they'll get educated. Instead, you school them. You take their children for 13 years and you create a system of passivity. Everything that comes out of that system is going to be a social mirror. And so the school on the west side of town is named Booker T. Washington High School. Graduation rate is 73.4%, but only 34.5% of their graduating students are college or career ready. So these children have stayed in school, they've stayed out of trouble, they've gone to class, they haven't gotten expelled, they followed the instructions of the adults in their lives, and only a third of them are ready for the next step. So what does this have to do with mental health? If we're talking about hopelessness, we're talking about people believing in their future, we're talking about mood, we're talking about anxiety, they're not prepared because society hasn't prepared them. And so what we see sometimes is that if we don't get it right, if we don't invest in families, if we don't give kids direction and the things that they need to develop in a healthy way, they end up needing what is called diversion. And I had the pleasure of meeting your sheriff. Diversion is great, but my challenge is always to communities and to leaders not to start with diversion, because at that point they've come to the attention of the juvenile justice system, but to think about direction and development, right? And if we asked more of those questions about direction and development, there wouldn't be nearly as many children in need of diversion. And the reality is there are different rules about age and innocence, about which kids get the benefit of the doubt and which ones don't. There are studies showing that even in preschool, Black boys are treated differently when it comes to discipline. And the way that our society is constructed and that we think about different children, what's in their mental health records can sometimes translate into the criminal justice system. So when we miss that trauma and call it conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, it follows them into juvenile court. That trauma is not looked for or addressed, and they're looked at as being more of a risk. So there are implications for missing it early on, for allowing that child to be exposed to it early on, and for it being carried forward in different systems. And so when it comes to taking action, I would challenge you that every single one of you is able to address these issues. Not fix them all yourself, but you're able to do something to address them in some way. So the first question is, what is your platform? And you may think that you don't have one, but I'm sure that you do. And it may be something that you take for granted because it's yours. But what is your platform? And what is your privilege? And privilege is a word that I think sometimes gets a bad rap, right? It's one thing if you sit on it and you're not aware of it. If you're aware of it and you're intentional about leveraging it to address these issues, it can be quite powerful. So taking action. So supporting decisions that support the healthy development of youth in all policies. So housing is a mental health care policy. Having child care is a mental health policy. Food security is a mental health policy. Having curiosity about communities and helping the helpers, the folks who are doing the work on the front lines. Meaningful resource allocation. Yes, money doesn't solve everything, but it sure does help a whole lot. And then partnership and collaboration. And understanding that every job is not for everybody, and that's fine. Thinking about where you are, the power you have right now, and how you can leverage it to address some of these issues. And I would say that all of you have the ability to be part of fixing these issues and being superheroes in your own right. And with that, we'll go into our Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Vinson. How about another round of applause for this incredible... Thank you so much. Well, hello again. We've had a good chat before this, so
Indeed.
I'm anxious to begin this question and answer. My name is Jane Santos Sweeney, and I am privileged to serve on the board for Family Service Agency. It's been an incredible experience for me. I'm ending my 9th year, and at 9 years I have to go off according to the bylaws, and I'm getting a little bit sad about that. I have the honor of joining Dr. Vinson in sharing your questions about the ways we can support youth mental health. As her presentation highlights, we all have a role to play in supporting the well-being of family, friends, and the community. We are here as allies to learn more and do what we can to help. On behalf of Family Service Agency, I want to thank all of you for sharing your questions and joining in on our conversation with Dr. Vinson. So the first question is, Dr. Vinson, can you talk about cultural differences and commonalities around supporting youth mental health?
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I think is really important when you're talking about cultural competency or humility is that there really is no cookbook, right? Sometimes you'll go to these, I think, very well-intentioned sessions where they say things like, Black communities do this, Asian communities do this, Latinx communities do this, right? And they paint them in very broad strokes that aren't accurate necessarily and that don't reflect the diversity within those communities. And so one of the things that's really important is to understand that the family is the expert in their culture and their values and the things that matter to them. So yes, it can be helpful to know some background knowledge, but understand that you're going to have to go through a process where you are curious, where you are open, where you are willing to be challenged with every family that you sit with in terms of understanding what matters most to them. You know, the other thing that I'll say about that issue is that sometimes things are called cultural when they're really responses that are to differential treatment by systems, right? So one of the things that you hear about sometimes is they'll talk about cultural mistrust in minority communities. Well, the people aren't wired to have mistrust. They've been in a society that's treated them differently, and so they don't trust it in the same way that white people do. That's not cultural mistrust. That is experience-based skepticism, right? But we don't talk about it in that way. And so, well, thank you. So I would challenge you that, yes, there are some things that are cultural and that have to do with the family and their values, but there are also things that are structural and that are responses to those differential treatments by different systems.
And thank you very much. Along with that, how can teachers support parents that feel a stigma about counseling in a culturally diverse situation?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying, you know, if we have any teachers here, thank you. You know, it's one thing to have one child and their siblings in your office for 30 minutes. You know, with COVID, everybody was saying we appreciate teachers, but I had an appreciation. Please understand, even before. And you know, one of the things that I think is critical in trying to overcome stigma or misunderstanding is people just genuinely believing that you have their best interests at heart. That you're not trying to pathologize them or put them in a box, that if they can trust your intentions and where that's coming from, that goes a really long way. And, you know, I actually grew up in not a very diverse environment. And, you know, what I found is that some of your biggest allies and cheerleaders don't necessarily look like you. And people can be receptive to that when it's genuine and coming from a sincere place.
Thank you. We have a personal account here. And my teenage daughter is upset with me for not being home enough because of my work and commuting schedule. Words and hugs don't seem to be enough, and she is starting to act out. How can I connect with my daughter in a meaningful way so she understands that I love her and help her to understand that I need to financially support our family?
And that is a tough question, and one that comes up again and again, right? There is some data that shows one of the things we run into as a society is that even when we're present with our loved ones, we're not actually present. And, just being a psychiatrist, I watch people like in airports, and people complain about kids and their devices. The parents are just as bad, right? So understandably, sometimes work or things are going to take you away from home, but when you're home, be present. And I think people undervalue that because they're so stressed, they're looking for ways to decompress. Just one more TikTok video isn't going to take that much time, right? But really deciding to be present in those moments when you are together. The other thing I would say too, coming back to that village idea, and this is actually a conversation I have at both practice locations. I grew up with my grandma, aunts, cousins, extended family around. And so many people these days are trying to raise kids without that family, without that network. If you grow up with family, it's kind of built in. If you don't, you got to build it. And so thinking about people who are natural supports in the community that can spend some of that time with that child if you don't have as much of it to give yourself, and trying to leverage it. And what I've found is that sometimes people just haven't taken the time to think about it. When I start asking questions, is there an aunt? Is there a cousin? Is there a neighbor? Is there somebody? Oh yeah, so-and-so will take her for, call so-and-so. And so helping people use their natural supports too.
Wow, food for thought. Can you describe tools that are helpful for families to have when dealing with stressful situations?
So one of the things that I think became really clear these past few years is that we have to get to basics sometimes, right? So for all of us, our reserve is less if we're not sleeping, eating, moving, right? And so really prioritizing those things that sound really simple, but that we know have huge implications for how you perceive the world, how you react or respond to the world, your ability to regulate your emotions. And so, it's not always as simple as, are they sleeping and can we get them sleeping well? But sometimes it actually is. And so thinking about things like devices in the room, bedtime routines that sound really boring, but can be really, really effective and impactful. And the other thing I'll say about stressful times too is that sometimes there's this idea that you have to be strong for each other, and that means not talking about what's going on or not voicing it. And what that actually does is can make it more difficult for people to understand that what they're feeling is a normative response to a stressful situation. And it can lead to people feeling more alone. So I think it's really important for parents to think about how to model naming emotions, feeling them, and adapting and coping with them, with their kids. Not feeling like you can't feel the full range of emotions, because of course you do, but demonstrating how you manage. Because the reality is, yes, the past few years have been challenging, but life has challenges. And so the idea isn't that your child never feels that range of things, is that they know how to manage and cope with them.
Thank you. I think we hit a groove with that one, yeah. And so a follow-up to that question is, at what point should I seek professional help for my children? I think that's a really tough one.
Yeah, and I'm glad that that was asked. And I would say anytime it's starting to get in the way of how they operate in the world. So they're not interacting with their friends in the same way. They're not interested in interacting with their friends. Their grades are going down. They're more withdrawn. For some of my, and I hate this term, I need to come up with some other one, but high achieving kids, the grades are gonna be the last thing to go, but they come home and they're exhausted and they have absolutely nothing left. So with those kids, sometimes they're telling their parent, I need help, but because they're not acting out, their grades are okay, the parent doesn't get it and it doesn't register with them. But absolutely anytime they articulate it, hear them, because the delay between when symptoms start and when kids get help is years typically. So if they're voicing it to you, it probably needed to be in place months or years before. So if they tell you they need help, believe them. But if you see any of those markers of functional change, that's important. And I'll say that, coming back to being present, part of being able to recognize that marker is having a good sense of what your child's baseline is. And that requires that presence and that closeness to begin with.
I've learned so much already. Oh my God. Wow. And we're only on question 4. What should we be concerned about with social media and youth mental health?
Yeah, that one. So, believe it or not, social media is not universally bad. There are studies that show it can be helpful in certain situations. So if you have children who are in communities physically, where they don't have a sense of community because they're different than the people that are in their immediate environment, social media can be a place where they find that connection with people that they find validating, empowering, and helpful. And so for those kids, under those circumstances, it's actually been shown to be a good thing. When you look at who benefits and who is harmed by it, people who are more passive, so just sort of watching everybody else's highlight reel and not generating content, tend to have worse mental health outcomes than the people who are sharing sort of positive things and being more proactive or having more agency over their experience on social media. Something that I would encourage people to think about, especially if you're a mental health care provider, is incorporating social media into your intakes. I know you never have enough time, and maybe you don't do it the first time you see them, but there's this generational divide, right, between real life and online life, and some people think there's a difference, but youth really don't. It's merged, it is the same thing, and so that is part of cultural competency, really, for youth in this day and age, to ask them about their online life and to ask their parents about how much about their online life they know, because that can be surprising sometimes too.
Again, food for thought. Wow, I never thought about it that way. Is there a way to encourage children to communicate when they need help?
So a lot of people learn and base their actions on what people do more so than what they say, right? So if you tell a child, you can come to me with anything, and then when they come to you with anything and you say they're being dramatic or they're blowing out of proportion or they need to just be grateful, they're not going to come to you with anything anymore, right? And so when they come to you listening, being validating, having a response that reinforces what you say you want them to do is critical.
Are there signs to look for to know when a child needs help? How can we identify what help is needed?
And that question of identifying what help is needed, and I'll say sometimes that takes time. Sometimes it takes time to find the right therapist, to find the right therapy, to find the right medication. But it's one of those things that's absolutely worth it when you think about what's at stake if you don't get the help and you don't get it right. But I want to preface it with it's going to be a process, probably, and a journey if you're trying to seek help from our systems, which often are challenged and aren't the easiest to navigate or access all the time. But in terms of knowing when they need help, like I mentioned earlier, if they voice it, but certainly if you're seeing those declines and understanding that society doesn't give our kids or our teens a whole lot of room for error, right? Those statistics about them being worried about their future, it's because they have a reason to be when they look around. And so those 6 months for a high school junior, when they're trying to get ready for the SAT, is critical, right? And so when you see that, I think the big take home I'd want you to have is that time is of the essence.
Thank you. And what about children who are less verbal?
Yeah, and so that comes down to that functionality piece too, and looking at how they're operating. And another thing that I would add too is thinking about how they can communicate and if they have the appropriate resources in place to communicate to the best of their ability, whatever their ability is. When we look at kids who are overrepresented in juvenile justice, there's a lot of representation of children with speech and language disorders. And we don't talk about that a whole lot, but if you think about it, it makes sense, right? These are the kids who are in class, who can't follow what's going on, who are getting frustrated, who are acting out because they can't track, and they're upset, and they can't articulate what they're upset about, and the behavior is focused upon rather than the driver.
What ways can we help a child stay on a positive path if they are dealing with issues that stem from their own family and living situation?
So one of the things that the late Carl Bell, who was a psychiatrist in Chicago, would always say is that risk factors aren't predictive factors because of protective factors, right?
Would you say that again?
Risk factors,
yes,
are not predictive factors because of protective factors, right? So, and I'll give you my resilience disclaimer first. I always bristle at people talking about resilience without talking about basic protection and provision and safety for children first, right? Like, who is it that we ask to be resilient over and over again, and why is that okay? So I think we have to make a commitment as a society to protect children and provide for them, so we don't have to have so many that have to be resilient. But the reality is we have a lot of kids who have to be, right? And so there are people with ACE scores of 4, based on publicly available information, that are the greatest gymnasts of all time. Simone Biles, right? It doesn't have to be that their story ends in tragedy, but in her case, as an example, she had grandparents who stepped in. She got treatment for her ADHD. They identified this tremendous gift this child had and nurtured and supported it, right? And there are things that we can draw from that in terms of support, family, appropriate intervention, identifying, right? If she'd been in a place where she didn't have the opportunity to do gymnastics, we would have missed out on her, right? So when we're talking about social determinants of health, things like recreational opportunities, PE, this is part of it too.
I hear lots of murmurs in the audience. What are the current breakthroughs in child and adolescent psychiatric research, and what might we see in the future?
So we're starting to see more people, and it's interesting to me for a few reasons, but we're starting to see more studies that are looking at sort of the biological markers of trauma, right? And that's getting a lot of attention. To me, like, you know it's bad, you know it has bad outcomes. It's interesting where we decide to put our money and our research dollars sometimes. But there is a way that that's being sort of quantified in a way that it wasn't before. You know, you always have more medications and things that are coming out, but I really see medications as, or the point where somebody has a diagnosis as like tertiary care, right? That's like heart attack level of symptoms, right? We need to be thinking more upstream. And there are all kinds of reasons around research funding and the way universities work that I won't get into right now, but there's not as much of a focus on preventing the heart attacks or preventing the diagnosis or preventing the illness. And I'm not answering your question the way you posed it, but
that's quite all right.
But we have it, and I think it's, and I'll put it this way: we have never known as much about the brain and biology as we do right now, and we're in a youth mental health crisis. It's a disconnect. There's a disconnect. That's not what's going to lead to our populations being more mentally healthy. It's us making decisions to set up people to be healthy.
And the final question is, what gives you hope for the mental well-being of youth? Hope.
Yeah. And I do have it because people are doing good work. People are doing, that deserves a round of applause. All you people. I mean, it is, I spend a lot of time thinking and talking about the things that are going wrong, right? But I also spend a lot of time with allies and co-conspirators and people that are working to make things go a different direction. And you see it working. You see people starting to have conversations they weren't having 3 years ago. And the conversation is not the work, it's just the beginning. But we can't begin to address what we won't even acknowledge, right? And so I do have hope in spite of everything, and it's what educators are talking about is as critical hope, right? It's not hope that's based on glossing over the challenges. It's hope that is well aware of what we're up against, and that will not allow me to become cynical or allow me not to take the time to appreciate the tremendous work that's being done by people in education, in housing, in law enforcement, in child welfare, in mental health, to realize different futures for the kids they work with.
Dr. Vinson, thank you so much for spending such valuable, I can't even find the words. Thank you so much. Let's give her another round of applause. Can I give you a hug?
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Really wonderful to see you all. We will not delay any longer than this because I know everybody is anxious to get out of here and head home. So thank you. It's been a lovely evening with you all. Have really appreciated seeing you and talking with you.